The Iron Beam in Israel, so we got directed energy weapons. We are hacking the entire traffic cameras in Iran. We've got drone boats. We're in the cyberpunk era of war.
You see all these kind of like incremental improvements that converge on what you're talking about, like this whole new capability, this whole new technology. AI is an enabling technology that enables the scale that manufacturing, that autonomy, and all those other things provide to be relevant. But it's also a technology in its own right. Every exponential is flat before it isn't. And so then the pattern matching becomes, is this just a flat line or is this an exponential curve? That's the tricky question there. Growth is not a choice. Like growth is an imperative, and embracing technology to do so is part of it.
Austin will go through kind of a rebirth.
Most advanced technology in the world, and if you can't actually build it or ship it, then what's the point?
You need storytellers who are able to paint the picture of what's happening at the frontiers of technology.
The U.S. needs to get back more to that and less like lawyerish and more we're building stuff.
The frontier isn't just a place, it's forged in the fire. Welcome to Austin Next.
Got drones going on the UK, or not UK, Ukraine. There are no drones going on in the UK. You got the Iron Beam in Israel, so we got directed energy weapons. We are hacking the entire traffic cameras in Iran. We've got, drone boats. I was kind of just prepping for this. I kind of like, we're in the cyberpunk era of war. Like this is everything we saw kind of in the 80s anime. Like when did all this kind of stop being science fiction and start being reality?
Yeah, right. I mean, it feels like it happened really, it's like really, really fast all of a sudden, and, it's a good question. I think, I say this as somebody who's kind of, been in the kind of AI world now for, the better part of, almost 2 decades. Things happen like really slow at first, then all of a sudden, and I think that's kind of what we're seeing here. But, it's driving a lot of
exponentials are a powerful thing.
Exactly, right. And it's on both sides of the curve, right? Because every exponential is flat before it isn't. And so then the pattern matching becomes, is this just a flat line or is this an exponential curve? That's the tricky question there.
Yeah. And so to your point on kind of all these things, and then I get into AIs on top of it, is it all been just like, I've been hearing about the idea of like directed energy weapons forever. And then all of a sudden they're there. Like, is this, we just made it through after 20 years or all this kind of stuff? Or is it like actual technological shifts have happened?
Yeah, and I say this as a failed physicist, right? So this stuff kind of like is probably a little bit, past me. But I think with a lot of things, like you're seeing with directed energy, like certainly with autonomy, you have this kind of like nexus of, hey, there's real hard problems to solve in power storage and power generation. There's hard problems to solve in optics. There's hard problems to solve in sensing and LiDAR and this. And as you kind of stack these 10% gains in each one of these things, when you kind of combine it, you see this kind of X multiple on like the combined platform, right? Like, I'm going to put myself way out over my skis if I talk more about LiDAR or things like that. But I think, when you look at like, say, autonomy, you see a combination of like, could we do this without cheap manufacturing and 3D printing? Probably not. Could we do this without good kind of sensing, new sensors, better sensors? Probably not. Could we do this without ways of navigating that aren't necessarily GPS tied? Probably not. So you see all these kind of like incremental improvements that converge on what you're talking about, like this whole new capability, this whole new technology. And it's pretty cool.
So is AI one of these things you just kind of said, like was going along the same, or does it become an enabling technology that none of this was possible? Or is it, an accelerant or yes to all?
Yeah, I think it's both. Right. Exactly. And I think what you see with AI is it's an enabler for all these other things, right? Human beings are incredibly capable, but we don't scale. And, and when you're talking about whether it's drones, whether it's, air defense, whether it's all this other stuff, AI is an enabling technology that enables the scale that manufacturing, that autonomy, and all those other things provide to be relevant. but it's also like, it's also a technology in its own right. We're seeing this in our personal lives now where, I think, everybody, got on Chat GPT. Many people are like starting to use things like that in its daily life. But we're seeing this hockey stick step now where, kind of in the personal analogy, we're going from just talking to Chat GPT to being able to give it our credit card and ask it to do stuff on our behalf. And that's such a step function, both in terms of like what it can do for a person, as well as also, to be very direct, like a step function in the level of trust and assurance that you need. I'm happy to talk to ChatGPT all day long, but at the point where I'm giving it my credit card and asking it to book flights for me, I start to have a lot more questions about making sure it actually does what it's supposed to.
Well, and it's funny because we had this. I was just listening to, Mark Andreessen on David Senra's podcast and
Yeah.
talking about how the idea. It's funny, but the idea of giving your credit card over the internet. They're like, "Are you insane? Why would you ever do that?" And now it's the same kind of question, right? Like, we will obviously look back and be like, of course I gave my agent the credit card because I wanted it to do these things. But we're in this kind of, I think it's two points, right? One is just the trust and the idea of I'm going to give something the ability to go spend on my behalf, which that's a little, uh, we have a Tesla. I was driving, I had it on self-drive today. And while I know it is good, there is a sense of still like that elevator moment of like, well, can I just take control and, kind of thing. And then at the same time, we've seen like, I don't want it to hallucinate while it has my credit card. Like that's not, that can end quite badly for the bank account.
Well, I mean, and your point about kind of like how we get accustomed to this stuff, I think is a really good one. I'm the right age where, as I was growing up and going through school, it started from, hey, when you're writing a report, be sure to use an encyclopedia or an authoritative source. Like you can't trust the internet. And then it went from that to like, okay, hey, the internet's okay, but cite your sources. But, Wikipedia, anybody can edit that. So don't use Wikipedia as a source, and like you keep seeing these little like kind of steps in terms of like both comfort, trust, and assurance. And I think you're going to see that kind of that same pattern. And, your point, I think, is spot on as well, that like there's a technology side of it. How does the technology mature? How does the technology improve? But also there's a human side. Just get used to it, and that you can't underestimate that cultural element of change too.
Well, on one hand, it's the worst it'll ever be. So all the problems that we have are getting better. On the other hand, there's a level of agency that you need to be thinking about when you're using anything. I mean, I remember this had to be like a couple years old now, right? Like some lawyer submitted a brief done by ChatGPT that had like fake sources and got totally and I was like, I don't have a lot of empathy for this person. He's like, did you not check anything? Did you just assume like this? I mean, even when you're checking Wikipedia or like doing that as a sort like go 3 layers deep, go to original sources. Like this is like any of these technology. If you use it as a crutch versus a tool, that's where you're gonna get into trouble.
Yeah, that's right. And your comment about like the legal citations, I think, is a really fun one because I forget the authors, but there's a research paper that somebody wrote recently, and they made the argument that, and I'm not saying I sign on to it, but it was one of the more interesting things I've read recently. They made the argument that, hey, maybe hallucinations in legal citations aren't such a bad thing. And I was like, okay, well, you've got my interest. Like, explain why you have that perspective. And their perspective was, well, what really is common law at the end of the day? But like common law is just kind of like an aggregation of kind of things that people said over time that seem to be best practices or seem to make sense. And so their argument was like, you take a step back on how these models are trained and how they hallucinate. Maybe hallucinations in legal references are kind of like what common law is going to look like, where these LLMs are starting to like aggregate and extrapolate out of real case law into digital common law. I'm not saying I sign on to that argument, but I'll tell you, like, it was one of the more interesting things I've read recently.
I've heard a similar argument, not the specific the common law, but just the idea of another word for hallucinations, and some people will get mad at this, is creativity. And so there's the sense of like, there are times when if I'm asking it to do math, I do not want it to be creative. If I'm asking it to do citations, I'm not wanting to do creative. But you point like that. If I'm asking it to think through and create, be creative on the argument side or fiction or whatever, so instead of being a no hallucinations, yes hallucinations, it might be almost another dial to put up. Like, yeah. I want you to be crazy right now, and who knows what we're going to end up being. And some of the things, I mean, I was like this, like I am always a sucker for those, like here are these really long prompts to put in using memory of like, you're a CIA analyst and analyze everything about this person, all these kinds of things. And, because it's fun and whatever. I go down stupid rabbit holes. And so it was one of these that ended up being that you put in ChatGPT, it was like the CIA do these kind of things, where their threat points and everything. And then I did the flip side. I said like, okay, tell me what your superpower. My superpower is. I'm like, don't glaze me. Like this is a deep analysis. And right at the same time that I was doing that, I was launching my Substack, and I was struggling with the name. I was sitting on like Innovation Next for a while, which just sucks as a name, and trying to figure it out because it was something deeper than that. And so like I throw this in, and it does this long thing, and it says your superpower is ecosystem metacognition. I was like, oh, there's the title. That's it. That was it right there. And it was like, I don't know if I would have ever put that, words together. But then as soon as I said it, like, nope, I hit it. And so like there was you could call it hallucination, call it creativity, whatever you want to call it. But it was this kind of moment that helped unlock something that I had been trying to kind of do.
Yeah. I think that's like such an interesting point. I haven't thought about it before in the context of LLMs, but I'll tell you, like one of my mentors, and somebody like I really looked up to kind of in the startup world, one of his superpowers I always really admired was like, in the way I said it, was like he has this amazing ability to be 10% crazy, like meaning like he's not perfectly dialed into reality. Because if you're
Right.
perfectly dialed into reality, like, you're complacent. It's really hard for you to kind of like push and move the ball forward. And if you're much more than 10% crazy, you're just out of touch with reality. And like that's not effective either. And like he has this kind of superpower of just being like really precisely calibrated to be, just crazy enough. And thinking about kind of LLMs within that kind of framework is pretty cool.
Well, and it's the timing. So I was listening this morning. I have a video episode with the CTO of Palantir on Invest with the Best, and talking about the heretics that are creating things, and that I don't remember his name, but the person who invented.
Sorry, not the CTO.
Right? Yeah, but I meant the person he was referencing who invented the nuclear submarine, and how. It took him like 7 years. He was the most disagreeable person. At one point, they wanted to get like
Hyman Rickover, maybe.
Yes, I think that was it. Yes. I figured someone in defense would know. They didn't like him so much. Like for some point, his office was like a women's bathroom. He, to your point, 10% crazy enough to be like, even Oppenheimer, I guess, told him this won't work. I see these nuclear power. I'm like, we could stick it in a metal tube and go forever. I'm like, yeah, you're a little crazy to make that comment, but clearly it works. And that was, he was saying on the pod, like that is one of our capabilities that is still putting us ahead of China is that we have nuclear submarines.
Yeah. And that's it. Yeah. Being crazy is a life skill, I guess, is a
So the lesson from this is we all want to be 10% crazy, and we want the LLMs to also be able to ratchet up the craziness when we want.
You just need a slider on the side. Yeah, exactly. You got my credit card. Let's push that slider down.
Well, but so then it's a really good kind of like, so when thinking about like AI in defense, because like look, the joke always is like, whether it be OpenClaw or any of these things, is like, do something, make no mistakes. I'm like, I'm guessing, please tell me, does it work this way? And if it's just like, hey, go win the war, make no mistakes, right? That's clearly not how it works, but it's the same balance of like, how is AI actually playing out on the battlefield? And then this exact thing we're talking about, like, do we want creativity in it or craziness, or in what level? Like, is it a level of difference in how, with lives at stake?
Yeah. It's a good question, and I think like you've got these kind of two, very, very contrasting viewpoints. One is I think people look at it like, let's take kind of workflows. Let's take things that have to be accomplished and let's kind of look at them and decompose them and see if we can kind of automate individual elements of that kind of broader, right? Like that's one way of thinking about the problem. And the other way of thinking about the problem is a little bit more of a blank piece of paper, which is kind of to look at the problem and say, hey, if I had no constraints kind of with where technology is today, with where AI is today, how would I design a new process that would maybe maximize the strengths of both humans and automation and AI? And I think like there's an analogy to be drawn here with the evolution of self-driving cars, where you saw these two very contrastive viewpoints, some that were very much in the kind of door one, which is like, let's build incremental automation. Let's start by going cruise control, and then you can take your hands off the wheel for 5 seconds and then, and kind of stepping that way. And then you also saw approaches that said, hey, look, like day one for this thing to turn on, we have to not have a human driver, and I'm obviously talking about the Waymos, of the world. I'll tell you my opinion. My opinion is that you have to design for the latter. You have to design from a blank slate, meaning like you can't treat AI as just kind of, this kind of, I'm from the Midwest, I'm from Indiana. So you can't treat it as like ranch dressing that you kind of sprinkle on top of everything. You actually have to take it as as a
bad metaphor for
fundamental
me because I do
element
not
of
like
design.
ranch. I
Yeah,
understand in the broader world, I'm the weird one, but no.
yeah. That's I think that's not a acceptable statement where I grew up. but in seriousness, I mean, what I would say is like kind of first and foremost, my viewpoint would be that we have to design these systems from the ground up to be AI native. Like we can't just talk about and I've seen it for years. Like we've brought AI in incrementally in small points of automation, and you get incremental benefit. But what we're starting to see now, and you already mentioned drones is a great example of it, is you're starting to see the first really truly like AI native systems come online, and the step function of capability that they provide is just unmatched. Now, when I say AI native systems, I'm not saying there is no human. I'm saying like we're designing a blank sheet of paper to kind of understand what humans do well and what AI does well, and kind of building a system to complement the two. So like I'll kind of like maybe like talk about just briefly like another historical analogy, which I find really interesting. So F-16, great plane, been around for decades, probably going to be around for decades more. It was the first flight unstable plane, meaning that if you just let this thing go, it would eventually lose stability and fall out of the sky. And so it was designed to do that because by being a flight unstable design, you could get a lot more maneuverability, a lot more performance out of the system. But you simply couldn't build that aircraft if you said, hey, there's going to be some flight control tasks that a computer manages, and there's going to be some flight control tasks that a pilot manages. And when you kind of started from that viewpoint, rather than saying human pilot must inevitably control the flight surfaces of the aircraft, you get something that nobody else could have thought of and built. And we have to really take that approach, I think, to other systems too.
Well, and I think what I like about the blank sheet of paper, but also the framing is I've never liked human in the loop as a phrase because it by its nature separates the things out. It's like AI is going to go over do this, then the person will come in at X point, makes a decision versus if we're giving human superpowers. I mean, to your point, like, okay, you have the F-16 and the flight unstable, I think was the word you used. And it's the same thing when I think we go to drones, right? Okay. When it's the current, a drone pilot can probably pilot one at a time. I'm completely focused and on it. I've seen those those POV videos kind of thing. But if you want them to pilot 1,000, the nature of it's not a human in the loop. It's no, I'm giving them the superpower to control 1,000, right?
Yeah. It's a fun, like you just simply fun. And, it's just as true, if you're building an organization, leading people, like the way you lead 1,000 people is fundamentally different than the way you lead 5 people, and it's a completely different motion. And, you're exactly right. I spent 10 years, like the first part of my career working in trading, like, equity stocks, that sort of thing on Wall Street. And what we saw there was this remarkable transformation from an entirely human provenance where you had human beings kind of waving tickets around. The way trades happened was two human beings talked to each other and swapped paper to this all being done, by algorithms on servers in New Jersey. And to your point, nobody ever set out with this like kind of a priori, like, hey, these are the things that humans will do. These are the things that the algorithms will do. They set out with the standpoint of like, we've got to trade efficiently. You've got to provide the best price for the best size within the market. And then you had this kind of natural like sorting out of like what elements to get you there were best handled by the algorithms and the technology at the time, and what elements of that were best handled by humans. And I think, to your point, kind of saying human on the loop says like, all right, like the Kissinger quote, like, who's got a question for my answer? It's a little bit of that. It's
Right.
like, okay, like I've decided what the right design is. Now you tell me what the problem I'm going to solve is. And I don't think that's right.
We talked about like the drone example because I mean, you and I were, talk about like the consumer AI, right? Like, and I get we're now in that switch over to agents, so it's starting to look a little bit different. I went in a deep dive explaining my 12-year-old the difference between agents and the LLM in that case. And then we used Grok to help us understand this. So it's always this kind of nice going down. But is that the way that we seeing AI, like especially like the blank sheet of paper approach in the defense world? Is it still language first, or is it a very different way that we're interacting with it?
It's both, right? And I think like what I'd highlight here would be that you have seen for many years that kind of incremental, the range dressing approach. And when people talk about defense, one of the first things that people always talk about is how data tends to be siloed or stovepiped. And there's a lot of things that people are doing to fix that, right? But now in this kind of world of agentic AI, as that data starts to become unstovepiped, it's actually allowing people really the first time ever to say, what's the entire workflow that we're trying to accomplish here? And if I, credential, trust, and verify agents enough, how can I allow them to access all these different stovepipes of data? And now it's not just kind of like hey, can you count cars in a Walmart parking lot? Can you, detect if there's like disturbed dirt or, when there was that wreck in the Suez Canal, count all the cargo ships that were backed up behind it. But now you're actually able to say, hey, like cognitive tasks, like I want to understand what's going on in Ukraine. Like I need to know what's changed in Iran in the last 2 weeks or whatever. And that's necessarily pulling data from many, many sources, not just synthesizing it, but also, and like most importantly, understanding uncertainty. And like that's the other big piece of this that I think people aren't quite appreciating yet is that when these things work, like one of their biggest superpowers is the ability to accurately say, I don't know, and create tasks or create new actions to reduce that uncertainty. It's like when we see this in our daily lives, right? Like how often do you
Wait, hold on. I don't feel like my AIs do that. They always confidently say, I know this or that, versus you can say, I don't know, and here's how we would figure this out.
Yeah, yeah. And like without really going too deep into the ones and zeros, that kind of notion of like uncertainty quantification is very much something that's like very active on the kind of domain specific AI. So, your general purpose chatbot may not be the right tool for that particular job. But, it's just like people, right? Like how often do you like hanging out with people who are always confident, 100% confident in their own opinions, like right or wrong, like it's a
No, what's the saying? Like you want strongly held beliefs, strong beliefs,
strong beliefs weakly held. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
That's
so
exactly
like
right. Yeah.
people would change their mind and get sense, and we see that all the time, especially like on social media. People are definitely not all in on their one viewpoint, and that's it. But so how does one of the things that we're seeing in this era right now, kind of is the speed of creation, right? Like people are like, we can create a lot of like whether we want to call it vibe coding or not, like, but even just being able to build so much faster while, historically, I mean, when we talked about the F-16, you're like, it's around for decades. It's going around for decades. Like it's what seems to be the exact opposite of that, right? The fast generation. Now, obviously I think we're seeing a very different era that started, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, whatever, with SpaceX, Palantir, and Anduril. And now I think in these new wave of companies, you guys included in that, where things are being approached differently. At least, again, that looks like from the outside. But how have we seen this kind of reaction? Be like, yeah, we can have new technology in a few weeks, not in years.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And I think, it's maybe like the 3D printers of the world kind of presaged what this looks like, in the sense of, I have two young kids and, so like the conversation point comes up often, like what? What do you what do you think, what jobs do you think your kids are going to do when they grow up? Like what skills do you want them to have now that you think will position them well in this world of like radical change that we're living through? And, I think for me, like the word is unfortunately overloaded or kind of a double entendre in this conversation, but it's like, you want them to have agency. You see that. I mean, like AI is this like incredible tool. It's, I think, been life changing for me. It's clearly like had an impact on you. but it just kind of sits there unless, you're driving it and prodding it now with the like, hey, here's what I want to do. Here's what I want to learn about. Here's what I want to, find out about. And that's like a fractal pattern, I think, that repeats on every level. Like I never would have thought about this, but my oldest daughter, she has actually it's, you might be familiar with them. She loves Encyclopedia Brown mysteries. And they don't write any more of them. And she's read them all. And so, we were sitting around and she's like, oh, are there any more? And like, looked online, like, no, like you've hit them all. And then she's like, well, can we just make some? And I was like, I was like, okay. And, and I'm not going to say it was maybe like as good as, the original, but, for the ability to just kind of like throw a prompt in there, throw a couple links in, and then, she was able to like scratch her itch for a, Encyclopedia Brown mystery. Never would have thought to do that. I'm like, wow, like that's a combination of like agency and, and creativity and kind of being able to crank that one out is pretty cool.
I worry for Gen Z because as any of these things, they're in that moment of shift. Gen Alpha, which is I think both of our kids are like, can have the opportunity to be very capable because they are learning you can just do things. You have this agency and creativity. So like my oldest is in a rocket workshop class. And so he needs to design the nose cone. So he got Blender, which is a 3D modeling software. He's using AI to teach him the software, which he just got through learning how to use last night. He's then going to design the cone and 3D print it because we have a 3D printer at home.
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, but you can just do it. And like, that's that mentality coming out. I mean, coming in like, yeah, we can just do things. It's fine. We can build, we can be creative. We can make new Encyclopedia Brown things, and like we were putting our dog in various like funny bathroom art that my daughter's not going to have on of like the dog, in a bubble bath with duck, and like, yeah. So it creates the creativity and the agency. Your point are these superpowers that are going to go and change how things are done, not necessarily the, computational aspect. I mean, I get in a debate a lot with education is we teach math, which is obviously very, very important, but we spend 95% of the time on the calculation aspect of it rather than the abstraction. Like, how are we using the math? How are we thinking about it? Because by the way, you have calculators and AI and Excel and all these things that can do the calculation in the end, but it's the usage and understanding of what these things mean. I used to, back in the day when I was at Beck and Dickinson, we ran the business case modeling group. And I just would argue like, this is not a math exercise. Like you need to understand what the math means and then how that drives your actions.
You've seen this happen at a really rapid iteration, within software engineering, where in the 90s or 60s, being a software engineer meant, punching cards, and then rapidly it meant, writing digital software, but, that specifically addressed individual points of memory. And then it meant, writing higher level code like C that, needs to allocate memory and needs to know what's going on, but handles all that kind of lower level stuff. And you've got the Pythons of the world. It's like, don't even worry about that. Don't even tell me if it's an integer or a string, whatever. Like, I don't care. I'll handle it for you. I'll figure it out. And obviously now we're in the kind of like early waves of trying to figure out like what vibe coding means, not just kind of for the hobbyist, but for the enterprise. But the point being, like, the definition of what it is to be a software engineer has changed dramatically. And the skills that you would take for granted today would be unrecognizable to someone who had the same notional job 50 years ago. And
the language is going to change. I mean, I wonder
right.
how long the term vibe coding is going to exist versus it's just coding. There are going to be different elements that you do and generate. And I've heard some of the stuff for like NVIDIA, and like some gigantic portion of their workforce, like their code is developed by AIs, and like, yeah, but it's good. It's also the reason I think this whole thing about, I don't like we're going to have AI CEOs. I'm like, okay, but who told the AI CEO what to do? Oh, you did. So it's not the CEO. Like, I don't like we these kind of things. Like, no, unless it spontaneously goes off and does its own thing that you never touched and never told it to do anything. Which, by the way, is a whole different set of problems if that's occurring. But like, yeah, I think it's you back these things out and said, no, you go to coding in ones and zeros anymore, but you are still creating software that manipulates the digital or physical world in some way. That is what they're doing. They're just doing it at a different level of abstraction.
Exactly. And that's a good thing, that like it enables, I mean, to push the metaphor even further, around what, like, kind of like after the Revolutionary War, 99% of the people in this country were farmers, like their job was to make the food to survive for their families. Right. And, I think, I forget the number, but I think, kind
It's
of
like
fast forward past
it's
World
like
War, it was
2%
like,
today.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I've loved that same quote, that same stat. Yeah, and we
Yeah.
produce more food than we ever have, and so
And it enables jobs like, we're doing a podcast. Like nobody, even if the technology existed, nobody have time to do that, And so like it enables like completely unconceived of, kind of avenues for human creativity that we just couldn't. And so I think that's pretty
yeah,
exciting.
you have the creative, like it. The only fear that I have is, creative destruction is an important trend and structural element to growth. What seems to be happening more and more in our lifetimes, the transition period's getting much shorter. So your point, like when you went from farming to manufacturing, I don't know, whenever you want to put we could tell like anywhere from like 50 to 80 years, depending on when you put the thing.
It was generations. Yeah.
Right. Like, the internet era started, 30 years ago, right? The mobile era started 15 years ago. The speed at which also means the speed of disruption is happening faster. So that's the one part that I think kind of worries me in some of these transitional things is we don't have the breathing room but we have the moral panics, whether you have, whether it's from bikes to writing to whatever. Every time it's like, this is the worst thing ever. And then if you go out 100 years, you're like, how could we ever live without this thing?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, and I think like people, kind of talking about like the moral dissolution of the youth and how like the next generation is terrible and the last generation was the only good one. I mean, you've got ancient Greeks saying that, 4,000 years, 3,000 years ago. It's like, that's actually part of the human element.
Yeah, but they didn't know what they were talking about. This time we're
This
right.
time for
Yes.
real. Exactly. The other aspect of it though, too, that I'd say, like on your point about the pace of change, just since we're hitting like the meme elements of, I guess, cultural literacy right now, there's that, I forget who had it, but there's that like one tweet that I think is really like hammered home with a lot of people, the whole, born too early to explore space, born too late to explore the earth, born just the right time to sell B2B software, and like, yeah, it's funny, but like, if humor is just kind of like, stating an unacknowledged truth, I think there is this kind of unacknowledged truth that when we look at, you know, the, when we look at kind of like where we are and like the physical sciences of it, I mean, it's fascinating to read, science fiction from the 1950s or whatever, because if you kind of really put a scorecard on it, you're like, they extrapolated a ton of stuff in physics, a ton of stuff in space exploration and that kind of stuff that, unfortunately we haven't gotten to yet. And then they also wildly under extrapolated things like, biotech, like, ability to like tailor cures for diseases, information technology. It's like they've got spaceships and lasers and things going near the speed of light, and they're all doing it with like one giant computer that's, 2/3 of the spaceship.
Blade Runner was famous for, like, obviously in 1982 or 4 when it came out, they didn't have like the internet or mobile phones. And then when the sequel came out, they're like, well, we can't suddenly magically invent the internet and mobile phones. So even though that was invented in the time between the movies. And so, yeah, like they're both accurate about predicting the future in the sense that I think it's actually the inspiration innovation loop, which is people were like, that's cool. I want to build that. Like, why do we have flip phones? Because somebody saw Star Trek and said, I want to make that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's funny. I've said this a lot of times. So Base Power, when they did their their billion-dollar raise and they put out their kind of talent push, it was this it was a newspaper and the kind of a very 1950s-ish type of like photo, but it said like, don't tell your grandkids you did B2B SaaS. So it's become very, on one hand, it's become very meme that like that was the too early, too late. On the other hand, it's saying like, we understand this now and it's not too early to explore, like we're going to pull all this stuff in, right? That's the change I think has been happening is, you can talk about like the great stagnation and what caused it from 1971 and kind of on. And it was just the digital bits, things that happened. But like, you know, getting back to like, the cyberpunk era war, like we're seeing stuff that we didn't, think was possible. I took my kids to go see the Starship 6 launch, because it's like, this is important. You should see this kind of thing, right? Self-driving, like suddenly the things that we extrapolated out and kept, it's coming, are suddenly here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think, not to get too overwrought on it, but, there's, we owe it to our kids and to our grandkids. Like, there's like a moral imperative to progress because that ultimately is the thing that kind of provides a better life for people who come after us, and I think that's really important. So I don't, I guess kind of like my point here is like, I think, growth is not a choice. Like growth is an imperative, and embracing technology to do so is part of that.
Yes. And part of that, I think we focused, it's gonna be the greatest pivot ever. We focus, we focus a lot on the technology itself, right? And here's the widget, the whatever, whether it could be a small thing, all the way to, AI. But the other part that doesn't so much, I think, get talked about is the business model evolution, the economics evolution that come around with it. You saw like cloud computing enabled SaaS, right? Like it wasn't one that had, it was them together and seeing that. One of the things that I'm seeing, obviously, I feel like we're moving away from the era of, and feel free to tell me I'm totally wrong, of like the gigantic, billion and billions of dollars programs in defense, right? The faster iteration, it just comes at a very different lens, especially when the whole number, and correct me if I'm wrong here, like it was like we're shooting a $5 or $500 drone with like $1 million, like that doesn't work,
Yeah.
and so like the entire economics change, but like you can't, if you're going to create the $500 drone, the $5 drone, the $3 late, like we have to be thinking in a very different mode. So like how much does like the economics of defense change?
Profoundly, right? And your example's spot on. I think one of the maybe like bad cultural lessons we learned in World War II was this idea that like, hey, we can just manufacture our way out of a war. Like it's a little bit reductive, but our kind of view in World War II was like, if we just
War II was that way. The Civil War was that.
Yeah.
I mean, like
if we
it
just
was,
bury our opponent in a pile of manufactured goods, eventually,
but it
like
worked.
that'll.
Like
worked,
I'm not going to knock that. It did it in that era. It worked and was the lever to pull.
But that worked in an era where like GDP and manufacturing capability told the math on that. When you look at what the GDP of the United States was, what the manufacturing capability of the United States was in 1941, that's why that worked. It's a math equation, and you can look at those exact same numbers today, and it just simply isn't the same. It simply will not work. And that's just kind of maybe from the top down. And then your point, it's kind of from the bottom up, is that individual capabilities, on the battlefield have gotten much more democratic's probably the wrong word, proliferated and cheap. Like one person can kind of marshal a lot more firepower and lethal force than 100 people could in World War II, and that dramatically changes that calculus. Your point about business models, I think, I think the kind of defense industry, is kind of already there, right? Like you're seeing this with, like you mentioned, Palantir, Anduril, at the, I don't know if neoprimes is the preferred term of art, but at the end of the day, like what's the core of their business model? Like the core of their business model is that they're saying like, we're going to take our own capital, we're going to take venture capital and invest it in building stuff. We're going to wear the risk, right? Their business model is like, we're going to wear the risk. If it doesn't work, or you don't buy it, or you don't like it, ultimately that's money that we've flushed down the drain. And that's a dramatic departure from the previous business model that kind of dominated the space, which was like, we'll give you a PowerPoint, we'll give you an artist rendering or a sketch, but like we don't start building until you start paying, and you wear the risk in that scenario. And I think, very bluntly, and I've had people kind of within, on the government side tell me this, and I love them for telling me this, like, we don't want to pay for development anymore. And especially kind of like in where we sit, with software and AI, that's kind of music to my ears because, I would say, first of all, like you shouldn't, like you know, I do what I do because I have a strongly opinionated view on what products, the market needs and what we can deliver. And if I'm wrong about that, like I should own the consequence of that decision. Like if I'm wrong about that, I shouldn't say like, "Oop, I was wrong. Like I need more money in 5 more years." Like that's just simply an unacceptable statement. And in particular, you're seeing that very much with AI, right? Where the the pace of model development, the ability of these models to like push the frontier is like, forget about government procurement. Just even think about commercial procurement. Like, you can wake up tomorrow and there's new models and new capabilities out there. And so, there's
The story I like to tell on that is 2 years ago, my oldest went to like an AI, working on like AI camp.
yeah,
My two younger kids went to that same camp the following year, and everything that my oldest was doing, my 5-year-old, that was what he was doing in their lessons. It was like,
yeah,
okay, and this is for kids. And then you said like what for you and I, or then experts in these different things. Like you should imagine the speed and ability that has been proliferated.
when you kind of look at the numbers, behind that, if the SaaS model, to your point, was like you take a giant fixed amount of capital, you burn that down to develop a product, which you can then distribute at pretty much zero marginal cost, and hopefully you make your initial investment back and then some. If that was the kind of high level view of SaaS, you're seeing that on steroids for AI because we all know about the kind of capital expenditures in terms of power, chips, compute, all that stuff it
Well, that
takes
stuff's
to build
cheap,
one of these
right? It
models.
only requires $110 billion venture round by OpenAI. Like, oh my god.
Exactly. And then, but like, but the math equation to do there is to take those numbers, to your point, and then divide it by like the mean life cycle of these models, right? Like
Hmm.
how long is that model actually the best model out there? And like that, it varies, but the
Days.
units on that are months. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's right. And so,
It was funny. I always I was like 90% into ChatGPT. Obviously, the memory function was key. Like I was always using that. And then I used a little bit of Claude and Grok for some other things. And then I think it was when Gemini 3.1 came out. And now I just spend too much money in because I subscribe to all of them. But the point is now I'm flying across all of them. I wish obviously I had more portable memory. That'd be great. But like it's become this, oh, you're better now on this. Oh, you just did this. You said like the constantly iterations that are coming. Like it's like great, awesome. The thing I couldn't do 2 weeks ago, I can do now.
and so, you need a business model that supports that. And then if you're, you know, if you're in the defense space and your business model is like, I'm going to ask someone to pay me a bunch of money up front to both like build the model and then buy it as a capital asset. Like you are completely 180 degrees out of sync with the actual kind of business model that the technology is driving.
But how does like when we think about the fast iteration cycle, the business model, but like there's obviously a training element that is, I think, at a much higher necessary level in defense than in say consumer, right? Like I can screw up things and that's fine in this versus, you know, where it's ready or how I mean how fast we're sandboxing it to deploying it. How does the business model like kind of fit into with that element on top of it?
Yeah, and I think in the same way that I do like, kind of pulling analogies from SaaS because I think many of the patterns in AI are like SaaS, but amplified. One of the lessons we learned in that kind of like SaaS evolution was that, one demand, and I think this is your point, is like you need to like ship fast, iterate fast, right? Like we all learned that lesson. But on the other hand, you're like, now I've got like paying customers and I've got SLAs and I've got like the obligation for this software to work. And, and kind of out of that tension was born this idea of like, well, you know, we need automated testing. We need automated, CI/CD or deployment pipelines. We need to automate all this stuff that goes from like, I've got a build of some software to like assuring myself that it'll work with a minimum of critical errors and that I can automate the deploying and the scaling of that software. That was kind of like one of the lessons, like the collective we learned in the SaaS thing was like, that's how you balance that tension. So for AI, it's a very similar story where like you need to just accept that the pace of the model development is going to be lightning fast. But then what that means is that you need to automate your test and evaluation. That when that model kind of comes off the training run, you need to know, hey, it's going to operate in these domains. I have data sets that are specific to that domain that I can use to kind of formally test and evaluate how this model's performing. I put it into production. I need to also now, the way I talk about it, I love analogies if that hasn't come across, like cybersecurity.
My actual degree is in writing, so metaphor and analogies are important for storytelling.
Stock and trade, exactly. Yeah. Cybersecurity went through a similar kind of revolution where they're like, hey, we've had this kind of previous framework of you authenticate, you get through the firewall, and then you're in. And that created a huge amounts of problems. And that's kind of where this idea of like zero trust architecture, like you continually re-authenticate yourself every time you take actions within the system was born. It's the same thing for AI. You put a model into production, you need to continuously monitor it. You need to basically ask the question at inference time, do I believe that this model is going to give me an accurate answer or not? And use that as kind of your second key element of performance and of security. And then the third part is like, these aren't science experiments. They exist within workflows. To use the credit card example, you're going to want, deterministic guardrails on. It's like I've got on my phone, I'm sure we all have mobile banking, it's not much different from that. We're like, hey, look, don't ever do a transaction over $100 without checking with me first. Don't ever under any circumstances exceed $1,000. Whatever those sorts of things are, you want deterministic guardrails on the things that you're like, these absolutely shouldn't happen, or if they will happen, they only can happen if there's a human being saying like, I know what I'm doing, I know why I'm doing it, override. And I think when you put those three things together, like formal T&E on the front, continuous monitoring in the middle, and then deterministic guardrails in the back, you can put a lot of stock in trade and the ability of these things to perform in very dynamic and very evolving environments. But without it, you're not in quite a steady ground.
How do you put that framework plus kind of the business model evolution that we're talking about with the, for lack of a better term, the AI arms race, both on the broad scale and the race to AGI? I'm getting I don't like that term because if you can't clearly define it and the definition keeps moving, then I don't think we know what we're talking about. But both on that sense and then on the defense side, when you're thinking about China, Russia, like these other type of players, they're obviously doing it in a very different way, right? And having kind of different guardrails or different motivations.
Yeah, I think like the combination, because the drumbeat on the assurance piece that I just kind of laid through is like, you have to know what the model's being used for, and you have to define trust kind of within that space. It's not an abstract concept. It's like, I need you to do this task. Can you demonstrate to me, just like you would with a human being? Like, if you say like you're ready to drive a car, like, okay, like, but you don't take a math test, you take a driving test. Like you demonstrate competency like on that task. And
maybe we should have them do math tests too.
Never hurts.
Essentially, what we're doing, we're making the driverless cars take math tests and and vision tests. So like, there's additional elements we're doing.
Exactly, it's a good point. And so like, I think like the point of that is like when you couple that with the business model to your question, you just kind of naturally move into space, and you're seeing this all over the commercial world now. Pay for outcomes, like allow the system to abstract away. Like, hey, I'm not going to nickel and dime you for the compute. I'm not going to sell you the model as a capital asset. But like, we need to understand the workflow that you want to get, and like, let's price and trade on that outcome rather than kind of like the individual kind of pieces within that. And you're seeing that, like, I think very, very commonly in the AI space, like customer success agents. It's like, did you handle this? Did you handle this complaint, this refund, whatever, without a human intervening? If so, like, great, that's worth something to me. If not, I'm not.
You got to be so careful though with the outcomes, because was it Delta that had the person with the bereavement, and they gave some huge number or something, and it was completely
exactly.
But it was a happy customer.
Happy customer. I mean, I'd say like that's a pretty profound failure on the deterministic guardrails.
Clearly.
Yeah, you can't.
But it was interesting. I think if I remember the court case that came from that was like, no, you're liable. The fact that you didn't put the guardrails in place is not the customer's fault.
Yeah. Well, and not to kind of say that like, nothing's new here, but there's a very famous case. I think like Revlon is like actually the name, like that was a company in the court case where, a human at a bank like mistakenly wired like millions upon millions of dollars to somebody, and they were like, great, like you owe me the money, I'm keeping it. So these are the same mistakes regardless of who's pushing the buttons on the other side. The question is, how do you make less of them, and and how do you execute the overall workflow faster?
Going a little bit to Striveworks for a moment, when we're releasing this, you guys have just announced a strategic growth investment from Washington Harbor. What does that mean for you guys? What's going on?
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. Like we've talked a lot already about the kind of overall, I don't know, this just like this secular trend of kind of like where AI is going and where AI is going, particularly defense, and we're just seeing that exponentiate, right? And like what's driving that really is like what we talked about, the need for scale, the need for this to grow, a little bit beyond like the envelope of human beings. And that's quite frankly, it's very exciting for us and for our business. So with Washington Harbor on the team, their real deep expertise in this space and their kind of knowledge about it's going to be awesome for us as we kind of build out our engineering, our R&D team to really scale that out.
I always want to end on the same question. It's kind of new this year. So when you're kind of looking ahead on what's next on your radar, whether it's a trend, a tech, an experiment, what represents a critical hinge point coming up?
It is this agentic AI revolution. I've been doing, my PhD was kind of doing AI stuff. And so I've been around the space for quite some time. And I think I've lived through both some hype cycles and some why this time is different cycles. Like I genuinely believe that this is one of those this time is different cycles. And we're going to see, that just kind of radically transform huge chunks of our economy. And we've kept hammering the point in this conversation about like what would it take for you to trust an agent with your credit card, but I think that's like such a good distillation of both where we're at in terms of ability and where we need to be in terms of kind of the confidence and assurance around these things to execute tasks. And yeah, that's kind of like the big question that's occupying kind of ton of my thought and my time.
That's the lookout, is when do you give the agent your credit card, or when to a large portion of people doing that, versus there are plenty of people giving agents their credit cards and you're like, yeah.
When do you take it for granted? Like when do you just kind of groan to yourself like, oh, I've got to type my credit card in? Are you serious? Like this is so antiquated. Like when do we get there? And I think it'll be sooner than we think.
Oh yeah, it's definitely longer than we'd like and much faster than we think.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Well, Jim, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Hey, Jason, it's great to be here. It's a lot of fun. Thank you.